Welcome back. The designation of elections as critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security in 2017 was a major turning point in how the federal government saw its role in the voting process. That designation then was not universally beloved, but the 2020 election was the most secure on record. That's a testament to the great work done at every level of government. No one has covered election cybersecurity as closely as political cybersecurity reporter Eric Eller. Eric, thank you for being with us today, and the panel is yours.
All right, thanks so much, Matt, for that introduction and for inviting me to moderate this session. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in to watch. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy right now. We've got a great group of panelists today who represent key segments of the election security community. I'm going to introduce them one by one here. Maggie Toulouse-Oliver is the Secretary of State of New Mexico, serving since December 2016. She's also in the middle of a one-year term as the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Donald Palmer is the vice chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, a federal agency that offers guidance to state and local officials and certifies voting equipment according to voluntary technical standards. Vice Chairman Palmer was unanimously confirmed by the Senate in January 2019. In the past, he has served as the chief election official in Virginia and Florida. Speaking of Virginia, Chris Piper is the commissioner of the Virginia Department of Elections, serving in that position since January 2018. His past roles include the head of the State Election Board's Campaign Finance Division and its Election Services Division. And last but not least, Suzanne Spalding is a senior advisor for Homeland Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. During the Obama administration, she was one of the U.S. government's top cyber officials. She led the Department of Homeland Security's National Protection and Programs Directorate, which became the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And thankfully, we no longer have to say NPPD ever again. So everyone, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you doing this panel with me. Let's jump right in. Overall, I think it's safe to say 2020 went pretty well. We saw better coordination, more secure equipment, especially in states like Georgia and Pennsylvania, which turned out to be crucial to the outcome. I want to give each of our panelists 1 minute to answer this question. What do you think were the biggest reasons for the success that we saw? And then also, given the recent news just in the past few days about cyber attacks on federal agencies that went undiscovered for months, how concerned are you that there actually was a security issue that we may not know about yet? Secretary Toulouse-Oliver, let's start with you.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much. And thanks to Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this panel today, and to my colleagues. I think the short answer is that first and foremost, the folks at CISA and DHS in general were so deeply committed to making sure that they were working closely with us, the chief state election officials and our local counterparts, to ensure that there was a good relationship, good communication, that we were able to get security clearances and get accurate up-to-date information to fix a lot of the communication problems that happened back in 2016 and really smooth over a lot of some of both the political and communication challenges. And furthermore, as a chief election official and my colleagues and I were able to really come together to recognize this as an incredibly important issue in each of our states, and to really work closely together across partisan lines to make sure that we were taking a unified front on the importance of election security and cybersecurity in particular for the 2020 election. I do think the recent the information that's come out recently is concerning, and we'll be paying close attention and looking to what we need to do here in my state and others moving forward.
Open to whoever wants to take that next.
Sure, I'll jump in here. I think that one of the reasons, generally it was a success is we had a lot of challenges. We had COVID, we had the pandemic. Many counties and states were transitioning for more mail elections. So this was a real struggle, but you have to understand, the people that lead the elections across the country are professionals. Many of our local election officials, even though they're under-resourced and they don't have enough personnel to do the job, many of them are very professional, they do training. There's always things that we could do better. But I think that, from a DHS, EAC perspective, in a cyber perspective, we were much more prepared and aware of the issues than we were in 2016. And we had a number of years where this was a major focus of the executive branch. I mean, uh, put it this way, I never had a chance to talk to the National Security Council before these issues arose. And it was an opportunity to stress what was going on with the states and how we could prepare for this. So that's my perspective on how we were more prepared for what we would face in 2018 and 20. The last point you make about these issues that have just arisen, I think that this is one of the reasons why that in 2018, even 16, but then 2020, we are in the process of the federal government taking a look at, with all the agencies, what were the levels of interference from from a social media perspective, but also to make a determination if there was any interference with our tabulation systems. And I believe that we may know in a few more days, but everything that I'm aware of right now is that there was no interference with the actual tabulation of results or ballots. And the EAC is just not going to come out and say that ourselves. I think it's a multi-agency perspective that OD and I will put out. But I believe that that will be the answer, even though we have these other cyber issues. It just shows how vulnerable we can be, in that we need to be prepared in the best ways we can.
I underline everything everybody said so far, but and first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to BPC for inviting me to the panel. I would agree that the partnerships between federal, state, and local partners was amazing. The communication, EISAC coming on, I felt that no matter what issues came up, I had somebody to call that we could work through. We had here in Virginia alone representatives from the EAC, but the FBI, DHS, all the way across the board. That's a level of support that I've never seen before in my years as an election official. But not just that, I think election officials themselves, from the local level, but at the state level, the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, we were communicating constantly, sharing information, sharing ideas. And that was really, I think, the linchpin to make sure that everything ran so smoothly. I got ideas on things that I never would have had without that communication that we'd had this year. And it's been building over the years. As to your last point, I think that what it awakens in me is that we can't rest on our laurels. We had the most secure election in history. I would agree with that statement to my grave. But the bad guys are still out there. They're still working really hard, and that's their primary job. So we have to be on top of it. We have to continually be investing in our elections, and we have to continually be realizing that the threat is not going to go away. It's just because we were successful in 2020 doesn't mean the threat's going anywhere.
Yeah, Eric, I wanted to let these election officials go first because they are on the front lines. And I think they are the ones we have primarily to thank for how well the election went. Everybody learned the lessons of 2016, but certainly what I saw was state and local election officials making this a priority and working incredibly hard to make sure that the election would be secure and would sustain the confidence of the American public. Also then kudos obviously to my folks at DHS who did stand up, even before I left, standing up those organizations, those institutions to facilitate that collaboration and communication. And then on your question about, should we be confident about the security? I think the points that have been made are exactly right. The federal government is certainly in a position to provide some insight into that. But really, again, it's the work that the state and local election officials did to make sure that we had, overwhelming number of voters had paper ballots, that we had audits, that we had ways to check to see whether to know whether there'd been any kind of intrusion activity. So I think for all those reasons, we should continue to have confidence.
And of course, there are still, significant vulnerabilities in the system, including the remaining paperless voting machines across the country, funding issues for election officials, the status of various guidelines and whether they're up to date. We'll get into all those issues in a minute. But I want to ask Vice Chairman Palmer about some work that the EAC said that it was working on. I remember, I think it was about 350 years ago in February at a NAS meeting. The EAC commissioners were there and they were excited to have a quorum and a bigger budget. And they talked about two major projects that they were working on: expanded security testing of voting systems to include vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, and then also testing non-voting equipment, which is currently outside the scope of the voting system guidelines that you work on. So I know there's been some progress on the second one. I know that the EAC has partnered with the Center for Internet Security on a pilot program for non-voting equipment. But Vice Chairman Palmer, could you give us an update on where those two projects stand?
Sorry about that. So we are moving forward on a number of these initiatives. As I described at NAS, it was going to be a multi-month yearly process. Obviously, COVID got in the way. But the status is that moving forward with our new manual, we will have what is called a TRR process. It's a review process prior to certification. And I don't think I'm spilling any beans here, but there will be a vulnerability review and penetration testing to see whether or not a system will go through testing and certification. So this is the system we're setting up. The other issue that we also set up a cyber team. What was the other issue that you addressed, just so I can address it? And so we are partnering with a number of states and CIS on sort of what a testing program for non-voting systems would be, including electronic poll books, voter registration systems, all types of non-voting systems that, as you know, could have access to the internet and are very vulnerable, yet there are very few states that do any sort of testing or review of those. And so what we'd like to do is we're going to, hopefully with adequate funding and a good report that comes out of CIS and our partners and the state partners, is see what we could do to stand up testing for that, because we do believe that is one of our most vulnerable areas. We're very pleased. We think we can improve our voting and system and testing and certification program. As I described, we need to do more penetration testing, but we also need to move into the non-voting testing program. And states are free to do this on their own. Some have, but we want to be there to facilitate that or to supplement and provide assistance. And I think the EAC makes a lot of sense. And so it's really up to, I believe we have consensus of the EAC to move forward on that.
And I believe you said that the new cybersecurity testing would also apply to the current generation of the voting standards. It would not be waiting for the second generation. Is that still correct?
Well, it's going to be for 2.0, but it also, my understanding is that we're going to apply this going backwards to 1.0 and 1.0. So all systems coming in, once that manual is adopted, I believe, subject to the will of the commission or where we come down on this, is that all of our systems will, from going forward, will have additional vulnerability review and penetration testing prior to the testing evolution that takes place with any new voting system or modification.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Glad to hear there's progress there. Let's talk a little bit about voting machines. So we did see two of the most important states this year, Georgia and Pennsylvania, recently switched to paper-based voting machines, which I know helped a lot of people sleep better at night once we started seeing those legal challenges and conspiracy theories. But 9 states still use voting machines that do not have paper records to varying degrees, according to data that we at Politico have been maintaining. And by the way, if you want to see that data, you can go to politico.com/election-security. We have a tracker page there. You can see if your county is still using paperless machines at all. Had to put in that quick plug. But there are also some trends of not just the status quo, but actually moving backward. In Texas, where Democrats keep saying it's going to be a battleground state any day now, we've determined that about a dozen counties have actually purchased new paperless voting machines since 2016. So, panel, I'd like to throw this out to anyone who wants to take it. How do we get to 100% paper records? And whose responsibility is it to make sure that that happens? Is it on state legislatures? Should Congress step in and issue a paper ballot mandate? What do people think?
I'll just speak briefly from my experience here in New Mexico. We've been an all paper ballot state since 2006. all of our counties, our 33 counties across New Mexico, have the same systems to tabulate those ballots. And we started conducting mandatory post-election audits of those voting tabulation systems utilizing the paper ballot since 2008. It's clear to me that that is the safest, most secure way to conduct an election. But most importantly, to Suzanne's point earlier, being able to conduct these post-election audits and utilizing the paper ballot systems to be able to go back to that record of how the vote was cast is the most important thing that we can do for confidence in the outcome of the election process. But what happened here is probably what happens to probably what needs to happen in these other places across the country, which is, a public demand to have these voter verified paper ballot systems and these mandatory post-election audits or automatic recounts or a combination of the two like we have here in our state. Because unless that happens, in other places, it won't. Here it happened by the legislature. It can be mandated by the legislature in other states as well. And again, my 2 cents is that I think it's best if every county has the same system across the state. So every voter in the state has an equal voting experience and equal access to that accountability of the accuracy of the system.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think that we've been talking about it all day. It's all about, it comes down to education. And once a lot of the problems that we're seeing post-election is a lack of understanding of the elections process. And the more we can educate the voters, that paper ballots is not a step backward. It's actually a great step forward for the integrity of the election. The more we can prove this election itself really shows how great the paper ballot system is, because we had it in Georgia, we had it in Pennsylvania, we've had it in Wisconsin. We've seen that we can trust the election because we can go back and check that paper. So I really think it's an educational campaign. We have a lot of areas we need to educate on, but certainly paper ballots is one. I think once the voters understand, they'll be pushing for it in all around the country.
Eric, I would say that federal government does need to provide significant additional resources to state and local governments to get rid of old legacy insecure systems and do the things they have to do to continue to make this an ever more secure system. And it just seems to me to make sense that you should not provide that kind of money with no strings attached, such that officials can go and use that money to buy what are ultimately not adequate systems. So I agree absolutely with Maggie that the ideal is that the public within that jurisdiction rises up and demands it, that the legislature mandates it. But if that doesn't happen, I think some strings attached to that federal money may be the way we have to go.
Eric, my perspective is that, education is important. I think education of legislators are important. And, after this election, I think what we have is there will be a big focus on the security of our elections. And I think that one of my major responses is, well, we need to upgrade and refresh the technology. And we have seen over the last couple of years, many states go toward paper-based systems to a point where it's a decreasing, it becomes more and more used. I think that state legislatures really have to step up. I mean, this is their elections in their state. I've had frustration when I was at the state level and the legislature focusing on this issue and the upgrade of voting systems. Obviously, the federal government can play a role. They did with the Help America Vote Act. They've had with multiple levels of security funding. But I think that, we go back and it may take if it truly is critical election infrastructure, this is sort of the core of that. And so maybe there needs to be dedicated funding just for voting machines. Again, I don't want to, the Congress usually doesn't want to tell the states how to do the business or how to spend their money. But like with the Help America Vote Act, if you provide dedicated funding for voting machinery, voting systems, and let's say electronic poll books, you're getting to a place where the federal government is assisting the states. Because the reality of it is, no matter what type of federal money goes into the system, it really is just a fraction of what state and locals spend on election infrastructure. And so the federal government can play a role in assisting, and it should focus on those core elements like voting machines.
So Suzanne did mention federal funding. Let me get a show of hands here. How many folks agree that Congress should provide regular federal election security grant funding to states? All right, pretty unanimous there. So given that, how do you suggest, what do my panelists think about ways to convince congressional Republicans to support that idea? Because Democrats are behind it, but Republicans have been blocking Democratic plans to do that even before the pandemic. And history suggests that they're about to become much more concerned about deficits in late January. So how does President-elect Biden and the new Congress, how do they move forward on grant funding when there is currently a lot of partisan opposition to spending that new money when states are still spending the money that they've already been given?
I don't want to overstep my talking time here, but as the president of a bipartisan organization, a national bipartisan organization of election officials, I think the honest truth is that there is sort of a wide variety of opinions on this. But what I will say is where I think there's consensus is that we acknowledge that cybersecurity in particular and election security, especially as it pertains to threats from outside of our country, are an issue of national importance and concern, an issue where the federal government absolutely has a role in assisting the states to combat foreign threats. And I think we have a general consensus that some regular funding to help assist the states is important. We have been all incredibly grateful for the funding that's come from Congress thus far in 2 sets of HAVA grants, of course, in the COVID-19 funding that was given to us this year to administer the elections. But the reality is that this is not a problem that is going to end anytime soon. It is a problem for the foreseeable future. We do need that assistance from the federal government. So some sort of regular funding, it doesn't have to be millions of dollars per state every time, but something that we can factor into our budgets and count on, and to be able to assist us as states to fight this foreign threat, I think is really important. So being able to communicate that message with our Republican counterparts in Congress, I do know that there are many. Senator Blunt, for example, who was a Secretary of State in his home state, acknowledges the importance of the federal government assisting states with election security. So we can get there if we have that conversation.
Eric, I think that the primary way to approach the issue is that there be an understanding that, the federal government is the junior partner in this, and that it really is the supplement. And I know that not a lot of Democrats and a few Republicans disagree with the matching program, but I think that it gives the state a skin in the game to make an investment in their elections. And I know the locals make the investment because they're the ones who have to spend all the money on the offices and the polling places. But often the state legislatures don't. And I think the federal government wants to see that there is significant match. So that there's an understanding that the state is driving the technology here and the policy, and it's not the federal government. And so that would be my approach is, and I believe the most successful approach would be, is that we focus on particular critical infrastructure needs, fundamentals of elections, and that there is a match from each state in the policies that they push forward.
And this is what the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommended exactly. Significant federal resources, but tied to a commitment from the state and locals.
So Vice Chairman Palmer mentioned the fact that a lot of this work happens at the local level. One of CISA's election security projects was something called the Last Mile Initiative, which basically sought to push election security information down to the local level, especially some of those small counties where a lot of the risk currently is. Let's start this one off with my election official panelists. How do you make sure that this help that is coming in from the federal government and also from some of the private companies that have gotten into this space, how do you get that to the local level, and especially the smaller, more rural, less affluent counties where it might not have as large of a population, but there could still be an actual hack or a confidence hack that undermines confidence across the whole state and perhaps even the country. So they are crucial players, even if they have small populations. How do you make sure that they are part of this conversation?
So we've been saying for years that we're only as strong as our weakest link. And so we really need to be paying attention to our localities and ensuring that they have the resources available. I want to highlight my colleagues in Illinois, Florida, Minnesota, and they created these cyber navigator programs where they're sending people out into these rural areas, assisting them. And in Virginia, we're about to do the same thing. And we actually had a law passed in Virginia that requires localities to meet certain cybersecurity standards in order to access our voter registration database. And we've been working very closely with them. I think it goes back again to the same discussion that we've been having, is that resources are disparate. And I heard my colleague in Wisconsin earlier talk about some localities, some of her clerks have resources, a lot of resources, and others are really struggling. And we have the same problem here in Virginia. We have some places that have really mature, strong IT operations, and others that are literally working with a guy in an abandoned store that comes in once a week, and that's not a joke. And so we have to get out there and really support them and utilizing all of our resources, not just private firms and these cyber navigator programs, but working with the federal government. I think that we've made some great strides, but I think that is the next big mountain we have to climb from a cybersecurity perspective, is really getting into the localities and working closely with them to shore up their cybersecurity defense.
I will just echo everything Chris just said, that, we have the same challenges here in my state. We have small county clerks' offices with 2, 3, 4 employees, no IT department. And so it's incumbent upon my office, which has a full-time election security officer, which was just getting ready to deploy our sort of field team, like the Cyber Navigator program when COVID hit. So we still have work to do, but that is ongoing and absolutely critical. And I think priority work, not just in my state and in Chris's state and in the states that he talked about, but I think every state is trending in that direction, importantly.
So I agree with both Maggie and Chris. I think that the way that I view it at the EAC is, the states are going to have to lead the way on this. And it's a difficult, it's a difficult process sometimes because there's a lot of counties often, and there is a cyber poverty level, I like to call it, where they need significant support. The way I see it, the EAC, and I'm hopeful to push some initiatives where the EAC could sort of provide free, that's the key when there's a poverty level, free cyber support to supplement what the states are doing if their states aren't able to do it. The Congress will have a decision on this, and the states as well, as how do we use those resources? Do we use them at the state level, at the federal level to then disseminate it, or do we try to distribute it to the localities? And I think that the way the EAC just wants to play a role where, look, we'll try to supplement where we can, provide free training or provide free, education in a curriculum. But that's the way I see it, is getting that last mile is a difficult thing to do, and only working together will we get there.
So we've been talking a lot about technology, but obviously even the most secure technology cannot stop disinformation. As everyone knows, for weeks, President Trump and other leading Republicans have been making false claims about election fraud. So I wanted to take this opportunity to ask you, Vice Chairman Palmer, you are a former election official and also one of the Trump administration's most senior election-related officials. Do you agree or disagree with President Trump that the election was rigged and that Dominion voting machines that your agency certifies were secretly modified to delete Trump votes?
Well, any politicians, and there's been a number over the last couple of years that believe elections have been rigged. I understand the frustration they may have, but we stand behind, not only as an agency, but myself, we stand behind the local and state election officials that administer these elections. And we stand behind the voting systems that we tabulate, we test and certify. And there's also it's just not the EAC. We do have a program of voluntary standards and testing and certification, the states, many states have their own certification program and their own system in place, as well as the localities would do testing, logic and accuracy test at the local level prior to the election. And so I understand the frustration that many politicians might have to say that an election may be rigged or wasn't fair. Um, that's why election officials are lucky at times to have a third branch like the judiciary. When we had a recount in Virginia, that was a very close attorney general race. Not only is it a bipartisan commission that looks at issues, but we also have a judiciary that looks and provides sort of oversight of that process. And we've had recounts, we've had audits, we've now had certification. And so I'm confident that, I believe in our systems and I believe in our local administrators.
So do you stand by the statement that CISA and other members of the election community put out where they said that the election was safe and secure and reliable and that there were no secret supercomputers changing vote tallies?
I do believe it was safe and secure. Now, I may not have gone as far as saying it was the most secure ever. Like I said, I like to wait, particularly while we're still counting votes. But obviously I stand with the administrators that administered the election and our voting systems. And I think that we will find out very soon that there was no interference with our voting systems and the tabulation of results, there was no vote change. And I think that's important because in the end, there's a lot of interference by outside parties, misinformation. But in the end, just like we had after the 2016 election, and there were claims about Russia, or in 2018, we have bad actors like Iran and China and Russia that may actually have the ability to try to interfere with our voting systems. But the evidence thus far is that they have not, and no ballot's been changed. And I think that's very important for the American people to understand that in the end, there are a lot of things that go right. There's a lot of things that may go wrong, but in the end, there is a calculation and an understanding and a final analysis that no vote was changed.
I wonder if you could, and we could have other panelists jump in as well, talk a little bit about what it does to confidence in the electoral process and also the work of election officials, including the two we have on this call, about the disinformation, specifically saying that they are crooked, that they are rigging the process. How does that challenge them, complicate their work, particularly when it is coming from, again, the top levels of one particular party right now? This is not something that the election security community is used to dealing with, is particularly prepared to deal with. So maybe Vice Chairman Palmer, you could start, since you are, at a federal agency, part of this community, but then let's go to others as well. How has that affected not only the ability of election officials to do their jobs, but also the outcome and the trust in the process?
Well, myself included, there's been a lot of election officials that have been in recount in tough situations. I think what they do is they look at the rules and they take an oath. They take an oath that, we're not going to rig the system. We're not going to change votes. And we stand by that oath, either at the state or federal level. We at the AC have had people threatened as well. And, we condemn that. I mean, that should not take place in the United States of America. Sometimes you wonder what's wrong with our society, that we feel it's okay to be angry or ask questions. Maybe your candidate lost. Well, where do we get off threatening people? And I just don't understand that. But I think that we take an oath. We follow the rules. If there's a recount, we follow the rules. We understand that we cannot sway an election one way or the other. Local election officials run the election. We are here to administer that process and oversee that process. And, we have a higher calling. Politicians will come and go. The election system that we have in the United States of America will continue as long as we can keep it.
If I may, Eric, I'd like to thank you, Commissioner Palmer, and Vice Chair Palmer, for that statement. Currently I and a number of my colleagues, including one of your colleagues on the AAC Commissioner, we're currently under death threats. I received several over the weekend. Many of you may have seen an article in the Washington Post on Sunday or Monday, excuse me, sort of detailing the seriousness of the threat. I've been running elections at the local level here in New Mexico for 10 years and now at the state level for another 4. And we've had elections in which Democrats have seized the day and Republicans have seized the day. We've elected Democratic and Republican governors, Democratic and Republican control of the legislature. My commitment has always been to the accurate and fair outcome of the election and to doing literally everything possible to both ensure the election is fair and accurate as well as guaranteeing access. When I originally sought to come into election administration as a career, as a very young woman at the age of 30, I never thought that my life would personally be under threat for the work that we do to ensure our democracy continues. But that is the reality. And again, it's not just me. There are so many of us across the country right now at Christmas time. I can't be with my 11-year-old son right now to ensure that he is safe and in a protected location while I continue to do my work. So clearly this is disruptive at a very basic level. And it's very hard and we have a lot of work to do, both as Democrats and Republicans and Americans collectively, to get past this very, very difficult and awful, wrong, horrible time in our nation's history to move towards unity and repairing our relationships and being able to build trust again in our election systems.
So I'd like to take a minute. I disagree with Commissioner Palmer. This was the most secure election in history. And it's because of the 4 years of work that the state and local election officials did in partnering with our federal partners. When we look at what we do to prepare for an election, there's logic and accuracy testing. There is on the backside audits. In every swing state, there was a paper ballot backup. We've had recounts that have shown that the election, that the results were correct. We continue to take a number of different steps. And I think it's important that we continue to educate about all these processes that we undertake. I think that the key that I would say is that election officials are masters at going down very dark rabbit holes and then figuring out how to stop that from happening. And we have put in place so many different things. And one last point, so I'm getting a little excited, but one last point. I think that if you're going to look at a positive thing about 2020 and COVID-19, it's not only the most secure election in history because of all the work that all of us did to ensure its security. It's the most transparent in history. We had cameras everywhere. We had people watching the process the entire way. I think leading up to the election, I got more comments about how open and transparent it's been. Election officials across the country now talking about doing audits, not just audits, but post-election reports. We've been doing one in Virginia the last few years. I'm not afraid to say, hey, we screwed up here, and this is how we're going to get better. And I think election officials across the country are excited to do that. We want to continue to improve the process, and we're not afraid to say this is where we fell down, and this is how we can get better. Having those discussions is really important. So I think that not only was it the most secure, but it was the most transparent in history. And I was excited to serve this year, and I'm excited to continue serving as we go along.
Eric, I would just add my experience working with the state election officials is that they take their role, their job incredibly seriously, including the obligation to not be partisan in what they do. And I always had tremendous respect for those fundamental values. And I can only begin to imagine the frustration after working so hard for 4 years and really building on work going back many, many, many years to make sure that we had an election that the public could be confident in, right? The whole focus really was on how do we make sure the public can respect the legitimacy of this outcome, to then have the President of the United States undermining the public's confidence in the legitimacy of the hard work that they did. And I think, as I say, I can only begin to imagine how frustrating that must be, and and I can see how debilitating it is for our democracy. And as Don said, they're experts at contingency planning, and I suspect this was not a contingency that they trained for or practiced for.
So in the roughly 10 minutes that we have left, I want to look a little bit to the future. I think one of the central debates in election security right now, particularly in DC, is how big of a role should the federal government have? I've said this before, but at the federal level, the election system is probably the least regulated aspect of critical infrastructure. And over the past few years, I've certainly talked to many security experts who have questioned how much we want to leave it that way, how much we want to have a sort of a heterogeneous state-run patchwork system, as opposed to something with a little bit more consistency. So I'd like to open this up to the panel. A lot of things do vary across state lines, and there's a reason why specific policies are going to vary, but fundamental security principles do not vary across state lines. Paper ballots are always better than not having paper ballots. It doesn't matter whether you live in Maryland or Alaska. So what is the role for Congress here? Should it mandate certain things that are essentially universally recognized as a good idea, like paper ballots or risk limiting audits? Should there be a federal ban on internet voting until the technologists can provide a secure way of doing it? What kinds of policies would be helpful from Washington at this point?
Well, I guess I could start. Being at the EAC, I think that you get a little bit of a perspective of the interaction between the Congress and state and local election officials. I think that generally Republicans, let the states administer their elections, make the policies that they want, and buy the equipment and make those sort of tough calls. The EAC, some of our success, some would say some of our failure, comes from the fact that we are really a non-regulatory agency. There's even our standards development in our testing program, it's voluntary. And so I think the EAC may be a way that if things aren't directly provided to the states to do their own certification programs for non-voting systems or other initiatives, if there's some desire for centrality, perhaps the EAC can provide some efficiencies and centrality to that assistance and do it in a voluntary way. I think that DHS has played that role as well. As it's purely voluntary, and different states are at different levels of cooperation and working with the EAC and DHS. I think that I think it's going to be a hard sell for a one size fits all at the federal government. We have to earn it the hard way by providing good assistance to the states.
The states are certainly laboratories of innovation. They've proven themselves to be. And I, especially during this incredibly paid attention to, under a microscope kind of election that we experienced this year, it's evident a number of the benefits that exist from having, different systems throughout the states. First of all, I really want to echo Commissioner Palmer in that the EAC is a critical agency in regard to creating sort of a universal clearinghouse, as well as an ability to provide, guidance and best practices. And I think that most states at this point, and I could be wrong about this, but most states at this point are signed on to the voluntary voting system guidelines and at least engaging in that at the federal level. We here in my state are doing our own and have been for a number of years, testing and certification of other non-tabulation systems. So I agree that the states are the place where these sort of best practices and concepts can really originate. And there is a value to having a decentralized voting system. I think we've seen that most importantly in this election. However, I would also agree that it's important to have some sort of standards that we know, every American that votes in a federal election, and this is just my personal opinion, is voting on a system, that falls under the scope of a federal set of system guidelines. And so I do think there is a role there. I think there is a value there. And, I think that we're going to have to continue to see how this plays out on the federal front and where we get to after this really unusual election cycle. But for me personally, I would like to see that.
I think most states would appreciate EAC taking a leadership role in a lot of different areas, and what Commissioner Palmer discussed, certainly a good one. I would agree with Secretary Oliver that the disparate systems is a strength for American elections, and the laboratory. Agreed as well. I mean, the states came up with risk limiting audits, and they're spreading now. But I can say there's not a one size fits all in any of these kinds of situations, or these kind of innovative ideas. So they have to be kind of worked through at the state level. But certainly having some minimum standards and guidelines on some basic things that we all do, like voting systems, like non-voting systems. Even on things like requiring audits, or we can all talk about that. I think that's a discussion that's ripe for it. I think talking about paper ballots and guidelines around that and sort of thing is all good discussions that we need to be having. But I think at the end of the day, I think the real strength, to underline Secretary Oliver's point, is that we're not all the same. So it's really hard to attack the national system. And that makes us a strong electoral system at the end of the day.
So obviously the Trump administration was the first one to come into office with the benefit of some of the lessons learned from the first major election cyber attack in 2016. But by all accounts, President Trump was never personally interested in election security. President-elect Biden has talked about it, but it's unclear exactly what he wants to do. So in the last few minutes here, panelists, what will you be looking for from a Biden administration on election security? And Suzanne, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, I certainly would expect that this would be a priority for the new administration coming in. They know that this continues, as other panelists have indicated, having had what has been termed the most secure election in our history doesn't mean that there isn't still a whole lot of work to do to continue to make them more secure, and that our adversaries, we should assume will continue to try to find ways to disrupt the legitimacy of our process and the peaceful transition of power. So I think they will continue to make that a priority, and I think it does start with this combination of providing significant resources. And I think Secretary Oliver is exactly right, on a consistent basis, not just, a dump a bunch of money every few years, tied with some clear guidance at a minimum on how this should be spent. And I think we'll see it will be a priority.
I agree. And I think my only 2 cents for the incoming Biden administration, and I am speaking as a member of the Democratic Party, and looking forward to this new administration personally, that I think that there were a lot of things that DHS and CISA in particular did incredibly right this election cycle. There was a deep, abiding commitment to, again, working with us as state election officials and local election officials and making sure this was done and done right. And I think my hope is that the new administration will continue that work and just, continue to grow it. And I think that it's going to be important to make sure that the continued effort that was made to work, let's say with me and my Democratic colleagues by the Trump administration, continues with the Biden administration toward my colleagues across the aisle. That's going to be critically important.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think that just maintaining these partnerships and increasing these partnerships, and not just with CISA and DHS, but national intelligence, regular updates as we're getting closer to elections. I mean, all of those things were happening. We just need to continue that, continue to build on it, continue to grow it. I think in those areas, just a focus from the federal level at what they were really good at this past 4 years, or the past couple of years. Communication, information sharing, those sorts of things were exactly why we were successful this year. And I hope that continues. I hope there's a big focus on that area. And if we have a continued focus on that area, I think we'll be successful again the next 4 years.
So from my perspective, having been in the military, served through 9/11, and worked in a couple of federal positions, I think communication is key, because the lack of communication in the chain of command can create catastrophe. I think that if we've learned anything as an election community, even more than I did over the last couple of years, we've had briefs and threats, but what's happened over the last couple of weeks, if a nation actor wanted to make a concerted attack on election infrastructure or election processes, they may have some success, and we would have to respond to that. It's a little bit out of my league, but from a macro level, I'm a big believer, based on my experience in the military and what I observed there, and in my time back in government, is that a good offense is your best defense. And since we can only prepare so much and have so many defenses to cyber, the creation or the continuing of a deterrence that any attack upon election systems in the United States will have a disproportionate response is necessary. And so, again, it's a little bit out of my league, but I would recommend that a strong offense is the best defense.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you to my panelists. This was a great discussion. Really appreciate it. And the Bipartisan Policy Center conference, we'll be right back.